The Parents Matter Coalition shares concern over an Illinois bill that would consider a parent's decision to deny necessary health care or medical services for their child a criminal act.
23 News reporter Cindy Stoffregan talks to concerned parents who say they deserve a voice in their child's well-being.
The Parents Matter Coalition looks to place a statewide referendum on the general election ballot to ask voters whether or not a parent's consent should be given for any non-emergency medical procedure.
We're fighting for their right to be safe and secure.
A proposed Illinois bill criminalizes a parent's decision to deny their child primary care, abortion services, or gender-affirming services. The Parents Matter Coalition fights to put parents' rights on the ballot this fall. Right to Parent Ballot Initiative Director Tracy Smodilla says all people should have a voice in matters of public policy.
This is really the best gauge of public opinion in the state of Illinois. We're going to put this question on the ballot and give all Illinoisans a voice in the right to parent. We want to help educate parents about what they can do to take back their rights.
Representative Dave Vela says he disagrees with the bill but does not think this is a ballot-worthy issue. He says making the world a better place starts at home.
I don't believe that this should be on the ballot. I think what should be on the ballot is, keeping our streets safe, having better education, lowering taxes or raising taxes depending on what the need is.
Concerned parent Christine Stensland believes this rally is not a left or right-wing issue. It's meant to protect children. She says the bill is a slippery slope to letting children make choices they are not prepared for.
We want to raise up the next generation, and when they can be so wounded by a choice that they made when they were 13 that at 23 they might not have made the same choice, we really need to be on board with our children and be their ally.
Visiting cities throughout Illinois, the Parents Matter Coalition looks to secure 500,000 signatures to place the statewide referendum on the general election ballot.
Thank you, Sydney. Amendments to the Abused and Neglected Child Reporting Act currently sits on the House floor. No further action has been announced.